And welcome back to Mr. James Roguski from California. James, thank you so much for coming back.
No, thank you for having me, John. It's an honor.
Not at all, and it's a very early start for you, so we really appreciate it. Now, you have been given the accolade by me and probably 1,000 others in the comments, James, as the watchman. You are keeping an eye on things for us because of external threats, and you've been following the World Health Organization machinations, developments, whatever we want to call it, in great detail. So firstly, I want to thank you for that. I believe you're doing a great public service to the ordinary peoples of the world, like you and me and our families. But to tell you the truth, I remember the pandemic accords and the international health regulations. And we've covered it in some detail in the past, but I know there's been a lot of developments. I make no pretense I'm completely out of date. So if you could bring us up to date, James, that would be wonderful.
Well, the one thing, John, that I want to tie together actually is all of the work that you've been doing. So, right back at you with the appreciation. Prior to these negotiations starting and all throughout, the Director General of the WHO and many, many other people circling around the WHO have used a phrase that 2 years ago, when I first heard it, I had to look it up. And so, I forgive anyone in the audience who's unfamiliar with the term. And that term is global public good. Now, the word good is in there. And so it leads one to believe that, of course, that is something good. And the definition of that is essentially something that is available in unlimited supply. Now, at first, it might sound impossible. I can get all I want, you can get all you want, and everybody else in the world can get all they want. But if you think about things like sunshine, now, granted, in England, sunshine might at times be in short supply. But, in general, if I go and bask in the sun to, maybe make some vitamin D to make, everything better for myself, that doesn't mean that my getting my sunshine is going to make it so that you don't get yours, right? Mm-hmm. Breathing, right? You can take as many breaths as you want, and there's still plenty of oxygen for me to get it. This video would be considered a global public good. People could watch this video, and if you watch it 10 times, that's not going to shortchange someone on the other side of the planet not being able to die. Now, you might get censored, you might be shadow banned, so forth and so on. But I think you get the idea. Well, through these negotiations, I think a lot of people have lost sight of what the original intent was, is, and will continue to be. Tedros very clearly said, and many other people said, that they want pandemic-related products to be a global public good. They want masks and diagnostic tests, and I hesitate to use the word tests because they're really not accurate. They shouldn't be utilized, the PCR process in that manner. All of the drugs, things like midazolam and what I call remdesivir and Paxlovid and molnupiravir and all these others, as well as obviously the jabs, many of which have been taken off the market because they're clearly not doing what they're supposed to do and they're causing, much harm.
A few things you mentioned there, James, also happen to be expensive, but apologies. Do please go on.
No, that is an incredibly important point, and you're spot on. Okay, you're spot on there. And so, John, these are things that you've spoken about at length. Okay, and one of the projects that I have is just to collect. I mean, think about it. Just in the back of your mind, how many videos have you done about masks? How many videos have you done about the PCR being improperly used and all of the drugs and all of the jabs? Well, apparently not a single person involved in the WHO negotiations, as everything I've ever seen, not one single word was ever spoken against any of these things as being at best useless and at worst, harmful, the masks and the tests and everything. I spoke with a woman secondhand. She told me a story of someone else who, was opposed to getting the jab, opposed to all of this, but was pressured by her daughter in order to visit her grandchild to get a PCR test. and the scraping off the top of their nasal pharynx caused a leak of brain fluid, and she ended up paralyzed. And so the thing that they call a PCR test is not a test, and it's an invasive, dangerous procedure. Okay. Well, the point of the negotiations was that nations around the world, if you think back, and I don't like to use this word, but I'm going to use it, if just for the sake of this conversation for a little bit, everyone can pretend to be a normie. Pretend that you've been drinking the Kool-Aid, you've accepted the official narrative, and teleport yourself back to December 1st of 2021. The core idea was, oh, if we could just get a bunch of needles and a bunch of arms, then COVID will go away and the world will go back to normal. Well, nations like Canada got contracts for 400 million jabs for 40 million people. And other nations around the world, generally relatively poor nations, looked at that and said, hey, you guys are hogging up all this wonderful stuff. The United States pretty much cornered the market on remdesivir, and so it wasn't, able to be spread around. Now, the point you made about it being very expensive was certainly a piece of that. And so the nations came together, and this is where I think almost everybody has gotten confused. This was not the WHO saying, we want to take over the world. We want to attack your national sovereignty. We want to tell you how to run your healthcare system. This was the nations saying, hey, wait a minute. The WHO is the forum for nations to come together to have a discussion over, health-related issues. And they were unhappy that they were not getting equitable access to pandemic-related products. And at the same time, they're saying that they wanted pandemic-related products to be a global public good. Now, I think people kind of sort of didn't get that memo, around the world, because that was in their own little circle that they're having these negotiations, all these meetings. The media didn't necessarily present that. But the reason why these negotiations started there were a couple of things. One of them was nations were upset, the poor nations were upset that the wealthy nations were hogging up all this wonderful stuff. I'm obviously being facetious, but they wanted the WHO to oversee negotiations to ensure that if there was ever a next time, and they're guaranteeing that there's going to be a next time, that they would get access to the products that they needed. Now, there was another aspect to it that, if you recall, when Omicron was first brought to the world's attention by South Africa and Botswana, when they handed over the genetic sequence for what they claim, was Omicron, brand new, very totally different variant. Where the heck did that come from? It didn't, mutate out of what we were seeing at the time. They thought it was their duty to hand that over, put it into the public domain, but then they watched Pfizer and Moderna put that into the boosters, make a couple of more $1 billion, and they said, hey, wait a minute. Now, this is another point where I think everybody got off on the wrong track. They then essentially said, wait a minute, that information that they found through their research was a sovereign biological resource. If you think back to, colonialism, where nations would exploit the natural resources of the colonies, whether that was spices or, oil and gas or diamonds or, gold mines or whatever, timber, whatever it might be, the exploitable biological resource of a genetic sequence of something that's very, very scary is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, think about the money that was made from the SARS-CoV-2 genetic sequence. I mean, we are talking serious amounts of money to be made if you have a genetic sequence that can be turned into pharmaceutical or biological products. So When the amendments to the international health regulations were first put forth, specifically by Bangladesh and the African nations, they proposed, both of them, very similar new Article 13A in the amendments. And one of the points that it had in there was that they wanted to have an allocation mechanism to allocate products more equitably. And their solution was very dictatorial, um, totalitarian. They wanted to have the Director General, if he was alerted, and I'll just use this as an example, if he was alerted to something going on in West Africa, and they knew that the United Kingdom made a certain product that could be of benefit, they wanted the Director General to influence the UK to send what was needed to where it was needed. Well, what happened in October, November, December of 2022, January, February of 2023, was they had an International Health Regulations Review Committee, a panel of like 20 experts, review the 300 amendments that were presented by all of the nations. They published their report on February 6th, and they presented it to the working group on February 20th of 2023, more than a year ago. And essentially what they said is, that's really not going to work. To put the WHO and the Director General in that position, there's liability involved with that, and you guys got to go back to the drawing board and come up with a different idea. So unfortunately, at that point, everything went silent. We never got a new version of the amendments until I published, or I should say I republished a leaked version back in March, approximately 3 months ago now. And so it was very clear that everything had shifted, and what ultimately was adopted on June 1st was what I've been saying since November of 2022, when the Indonesian health minister said, look, with the World Bank Pandemic Fund, the United States, the Defense Department, and a whole bunch of other nations are putting together this fund. This is a great business opportunity. Go invest. And so what has been adopted at the World Health Assembly in regards to the amendments to the international health regulations is essentially a trade agreement where they set up in Article 44 BIS. They use that terminology because they wedged it in between Article 44 and 45, and they didn't want to have to change all of the numbers that followed. So they want to create a coordinating financial mechanism. Now, the details are incredibly vague. They didn't, put in any of the rules of how that's going to operate. In Article 54 BIS, what they said was that at the first meeting of the implementation committee, they will agree to the rules for the financial mechanism. Well, how much is this going to cost? Where's the audit trail? Who's going to put what money into this, and where's it all going to go, and what are the priorities all going to be, and what is it that they're really doing here? Well, if you look back to why these negotiations were called, they want an enormous build out of big pharma around the world. In Article 13, what it says is that the Director General shall assist the nations in expanding their capacity on a geographically diversified basis. If you think more about the North American Free Trade Agreement or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, these trade deals, what they want is to take as much money as they possibly can, redirect it to an enormous build out of big pharma around the world, so that this is the thing that's when it really finally registered in my head, I was like, wow, this is almost unbelievable. The lesson learned by the WHO and big pharma from the last 4.5, 5 years, quite frankly, according to them, is that big pharma wasn't big enough. they had logistics problems. They couldn't get, cold storage transport of mRNA jabs, into the Congo or the Amazon or, the Kalahari or some other remote area. They're not as ubiquitous as they want to be. Their products are not so universally manufactured that they are a global public good. So instead of looking at your videos, okay, and talking about, well, wait a minute, the lockdowns were a disaster, the social distancing was a joke, the masks cause more problems, they don't stop any type of infection, the diagnostic, testing use of PCR process is a complete and total fraud, but it's really good for scaring people and creating a case demic. Drugs like Run Death is Near harm people's kidney and liver function and are totally inappropriate. Seriously, you inject something into the bloodstream to deal with a respiratory problem when very simple respiratory treatments are far more effective. And you've done, John, I mean, how many have you done? 200 videos about the jabs being harmful. Not a single word has been spoken inside the WHO negotiations questioning big pharma, because the WHO is the tail that's being wagged by big pharma. And nations like the United States, the European Union, which obviously includes Germany, the UK, and all the other nations, the ones who have big pharma industry, spent most of their time shilling for big pharma to protect their interests. Now, here's the curveball that I think people just, it wasn't reported in the news by very many people. On the Friday before the assembly began, on May 24th, a lot of people shared a clip of Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General, at the last meeting when they were trying to finish up all the negotiations. He said, well, we haven't reached an agreement yet, but we're optimistic for the upcoming week. And, we're going to try to come out of the assembly, reinvigorated and so forth. He knew something and he's being really coy. He didn't say what he knew because across town in Geneva at the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, they were having a treaty signing ceremony. The Intellectual Property Organization agreed to a treaty. 138 nations signed it. More may have signed it since then. And what they agreed to, and South Africa was the first signatory, was if a patent is applied for and it involves the use of genetic information, the source of that genetic information has to be named in the patent. And ostensibly, that's so they can track royalties. Now, that was one of the big sticking points because trying to negotiate intellectual property along those lines in negotiations at the WHO for a pandemic treaty, that just didn't make any sense. So they kicked it over to the WHO. I'm not an expert on intellectual property. I've spoken to some people who know more about it than I do, but just a quick read of the 10-page document, to me, it seemed really shabby to the point where on the first page, they were not even able to put the terms in alphabetical order. One of the terms was out of order. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it seems like it would also include any genetic sequence that's man-made, or artificial intelligence could create various sequences that could ultimately be incorporated into something like an mRNA jab. Now, one last thing, and I'll take a breath and give you a word in edgewise. One of the definitions that is in the international health regulations, they didn't end up calling it pandemic-related products because they couldn't settle on a definition for pandemic. They ended up with pandemic emergency. We could talk about that if you wish. But what they ended up calling it was relevant health products. Well, that includes diagnostics and PPE like masks and drugs and jabs. But in these secret meetings that they had all week at the assembly, they added gene and cell-based therapies and other technological medical treatments. And so, maybe things like CRISPR, it's wide open, it could be anything. And so essentially what came out of this agreement, I think, is worse than what the nations originally asked for. If you know the concept of if a man is hungry and you give him a fish, you feed him for a day, but if you teach him how to fish, then he can fend for himself. Well, the nations were asking for an allocation mechanism, but what they got was a coordinating financial mechanism. So investment will go to the countries where oligarchs want to get involved in testing or laboratories or manufacturing or whatever, so that all of the nations around the world can manufacture an unlimited amount of things that I think are horrible. And everybody can have their own opinion, but do we really need more manufacturing capacity for mRNA jabs or more drugs or more masks or more diagnostic tests? Well, that is apparently what everyone at the WHO believes is the way to prevent, prepare for, or respond to the next pandemic. But I think what they're doing is they want to look for pathogens with pandemic profiteering potential, bring those pathogens into their WHO coordinated laboratory network, submit whatever sequence they identify or create to the pathogen access and benefit sharing system, so that royalties can be gained and benefits can be shared, and then whatever products are made, contracts would flow through the WHO to put billions of dollars worth of material into their global distribution and logistics network, so that at any point in time, if the Director General wants to declare a public health emergency of international concern, or PHEIC, fake, or what I call a super fake, because he could upgrade that to a pandemic emergency, which, quite frankly, is just a word that makes it sound scarier. Declare that there's a problem, and then on a local level, this is not the WHO mandating anything. This is them just facilitating local tyrants doing the same darn thing they did over the last 4.5, 5 years. But now there's an unlimited supply. Now, if you recall, there were periods of time and there were areas in the world where people were clamoring for the jabs, but they couldn't get them. Well, that was the problem that they identified that needed to be solved. The lessons that you learned, the lessons that I learned, the lessons that your audience learned from the last 4.5 years probably weren't, oh, we didn't have enough jabs, we didn't have enough drugs, we didn't have enough masks, right? We didn't have enough tests. Well, if you look at it, the nations that had almost unlimited access to the PCR test had the highest, number of cases and the highest death rate attributed to COVID. Was that because they had more COVID or because they had better propaganda? And so there are a number of people who have glossed over, what actually happened in the World Health Assembly. And part of the reason is, interestingly enough, their nomenclature in their documents, the WHO, is that any amendment normally would be in bold, underlined font. But for their amendments, they did put them in bold, except for the things that I've just been talking about. They conveniently forgot to even do that. So if someone isn't paying super, super close attention and has read the original and is comparing it to the new, Articles 44 and 54 BIS appear to not be amendments because they're not in bold print. Okay, so what we're dealing with here, we had more than enough evidence prior to all of this to understand that the WHO is just the tail that is being wagged by the big dog of big pharma. Their $4 billion a year budget is like lunch money for Pfizer. And, we've got this massive conglomeration of companies. And one of the lines in Article 44 BIS, very subtle language, but essentially it says that any organization or entity that helps nations is in line for funding through this funding mechanism. And for me, that explains why there were 400 relevant stakeholders hovering over, these negotiations, cheering them on, because everybody has, they want a piece of the pie. And so I don't think we really need any more information to understand that the WHO is not trying to improve our health. The things that they recommend tend to degrade our health at the expense of increasing the wealth of their donors and their relevant stakeholders. They are captured completely, and the vast majority of the nations, especially the wealthier nations, they were just defending the big pharma position. And when that IP agreement was agreed upon, it seemed like the logjam broke. And on Tuesday, May 28th, when they were supposed to be discussing the amendments in the treaty, they realized that they had an opportunity to continue. So they stayed up till 2, 3, 4 in the morning on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, on into Saturday. The Assembly did adopt the amendments. And contrary to a lot of news reports out there, the pandemic treaty was not defeated. It's going into overtime, if you will. They extended the negotiations. They're going to be meeting in July. It seems like they've settled the money issue. It seems like they've settled the IP issue. They still have issues with One Health and a handful of other things. But it appears that they're on cruise control. They would love to get it done and call a special session before the end of the year, 2024, and potentially adopt the pandemic treaty. So that is, my take on what happened. And the simple answer for what we need to do is to realize that we're not really fighting the WHO. We're fighting big pharma. And, that's not just in Geneva. That's certainly everywhere throughout the developed world. And they realized that they need to grow their business model into the developing world. And that is what these agreements are really all about.
Said a few things there that I did find quite alarming. Artificial intelligence making genetic sequences, that gave me a pretty bad feeling.
Well, let me point out, John, that's not to be found in specific language anywhere in any of these documents. In the Intellectual Property Organization Treaty, it doesn't exclude it.
Right. And secret meetings for gene and cell-based therapies. These meetings were held in secret. No published minutes that we were aware of.
Well, they included that in the definition of the products that essentially they will be promoting. And so unless you know of something that I don't, my general view of most gene-based therapies they're just still very much in the experimental stage, and the dangers and the harms are outrageous.
Yeah. International health regulations. So the pandemic treaty is probably basically the pandemic treaty is still going on. That could well be passed later this year.
Mm-hmm.
What about the international health regulations? Had severe implications earlier on for things like censorship, freedom of speech, freedom of dissent. Where are we with those, James?
When I mentioned that from October of 2022 until February of 2023, there was a review committee that looked over the 300 plus amendments. that review committee report that came out in February of 2023, I was quite frankly shocked and pleasantly surprised. But it was a 97-page document that put the kibosh on a lot of the things that, unfortunately, for the next year, a lot of people have been talking about. But the committee essentially said, look, we don't have authority for many of these things, and so there's a little sentence in Annex 1 where nations are encouraged to push back against mis and disinformation. Um, Freedom of speech is kind of tied to that, but there has been a lot of, quite frankly, mis, dis, and malinformation and old information that has been circulating around the internet. I have difficulty when I go on the internet. I'm appalled by the vast majority of what I see the alternative media and politicians and even health freedom so-called leaders presenting, because it doesn't reflect what is actually in these documents. And so it's really very easy. The documents are available. People can read them. I've tried to make it so that you can go to the pertinent points. There's more, in the amendments than what we've talked about. But essentially, the reason why these negotiations were brought, into being was a trade dispute. The nations are like, oh, we want more jabs, right? Canada's hogging up all the jabs. Everybody else is hogging up all the jabs and the drugs. And they didn't just get, something that they need to get by in a given day or a given situation. The agreement is exponentially worse than that. They want funding to build out that market sector, that industry sector, so they can make all the jabs they would ever want. And I'm sure you're very much aware, there's a queue of dozens, if not hundreds, of mRNA jabs in the pipeline. They're coming for your money if you're in a wealthy country, and they're seeking to manufacture jabs to go after the people that they missed the first time. And the starting point, John, is, I'm obviously, thankful for your work, but I want to encourage your audience to dig into your past work and, pull out the videos that you did about masks, pull out the videos that you did about, the PCR being a fraudulent test and the drugs. And I mean, God, you must have done hundreds of videos on the jabs. It appears that, the WHO and everyone involved is completely unwilling, unable, not allowed, or just completely clueless. Not a word was ever spoken in any of these meetings or any of these documents at the WHO questioning any of those, global public goods. It's a global public evil, and they want billions of dollars to make more of it.
To do it, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, those things you mentioned, James, are very well covered in.
Yep.
We did a whole series with Dr. Claire Craig, quite a superb piece of scholarship. What are the things at the moment that concern you most? What things could be changing in the next year or two that could lead us into a dystopian future?
Well, there are a world of things out there, to answer that question. And, part of the problem over the last year is when people have been talking about these negotiations at the WHO, if you view what you just asked me, the dystopian future, if you view that as a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, maybe the amendments and the treaty and the WHO were a couple of pieces of that puzzle, and they're tied into the puzzle. But, things like the Pact for the Future, with the United Nations coming up in September, central bank digital currency, digital IDs, geoengineering, climate change. I mean, this world of problems. Part of the problem has been that all of that gets discussed, and people thought, many people, I can't tell you how many phone calls I got, people thought that all of that was in the pandemic treaty and that, Joe Biden had already signed it. And people were freaking out that, oh my God, we're all gonna be locked up, and blue helmeted UN soldiers are going to come banging down your door, and each of those things is all interconnected. But in order to push back on any of them, you really have to focus. And I had people who reached out to me, and they had taken the effort to go to their, very specifically, members of parliament in the UK, sat down with the staff member, and presented information that they had heard on the internet. And what they said to their staff member, their member of parliament, was wrong. They had gotten inaccurate information from the internet, and the staff member pulled up the treaty and went to Article 24, paragraph 2, and said, no, it says very clearly in the treaty, um, nothing in here is going to give Tedros the power to mandate lockdowns or jabs or, any of that sort of thing. And so the person was distraught because they thought, they had gotten good information. They went to push their member of parliament to make a stand. And they were greeted actually with a knowledgeable staff member, rare, but in some cases. And they didn't know what to make of it. And so part of the problem that we have is we really have to be crystal clear and not spread misinformation. And a lot of information, if it's old, I've seen many videos from 2 years ago that someone found. They did a clip, they re-upload it, and so the date on it appears like it's new, but oh my goodness, is it old news? But when people don't realize that and they spread it again, it's like, wow, old news is misinformation. So at the very least, anything about the WHO and the World Health Assembly and the amendments and the treaty, anything before June 1st, a lot of people just don't want to do this. You got to erase it all. It's a lot of hard work when something new happens, and it's probably one of the hardest things in the world for people to do. And I think this is really the core of everybody's problem. When new information comes into your awareness, you got to let go of what you thought you knew and adjust to the new information. Now, we have this problem in our side. All of these documents are new and people are still talking about what used to be. But I think if you get right down to it, with all of the government officials and the media and the health, industry, when new information comes about, the dangers of the jabs and, all of the details about excess, they don't want to see it. They want to believe the fallacies that, they've been programmed to accept. And when new information comes in to anybody at any level, there's probably a name. I know it's cognitive dissonance, but it's really some kind of a mental issue where people either practice the scientific method and they invite criticism and they invite new information and they look at it and they compare it to what they knew before and they weigh it, and maybe that new information is wrong, maybe it's right, and maybe the old information is wrong. And a deficiency in the ability of people across the spectrum to have that discussion, have that conversation, have that, scientific method be applied, that is the problem of our days. And people who can do that, you've obviously exhibited that capability, many other people have, but a lot of people just don't want to hear it when reality is in conflict with their chosen narrative. And that's something that it's ubiquitous around the world, on all sides. If new information shows up, boy, you really should pay attention to it.
That's why we're grateful to you, James, for keeping on top of this. So I think the message I'm hearing is less individual points of concern, but more almost a philosophical shift to increasing pharmaceutical production around the world, with the control implications that go with that. And do you think there's risks also go with that in relation to information control. So drugs which might be repurposed, for example, that aren't expensive, or herbal treatments that have demonstrated efficacious to people groups over many thousands of years are demigrated, even though there may be potential efficacy in them.
Well, John, I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but part of my past is I managed a couple of mom and pop herb nutrition homeopathy stores over uh, about 15 years. And so I have not been to a medical doctor since I was 19, so that's 45 years ago. So I am lock, stock, and barrel. Nature and natural means are the way to maintain your health. And so I will admit, if in this agreement it said that relevant health products are vitamins and minerals and herbs and good clean water and homeopathic remedies and all this. Ooh, man, this might have been a good agreement if you are aware. I think you must be. Certain nations dealing with COVID, they handed out a nice little care package. Here's your vitamin C, vitamin D,
Yeah,
zinc, and
yeah.
maybe some herbs and maybe some essential medications, hydroxy and ivermectin. Um, if the path forward was here's a nutrition pack, let's make that be a global public good and universal. Oh, you want one? You want another one? You want some for your family? Here you go. Wow, that would have been something.
That
But
actually would be a global public good.
that would be a global public good,
Yeah,
but that wouldn't be profitable to the oligarchs who are driving these negotiations. And right there, you have the core of the problem. You've been reporting about all of the dangers of the chosen, solutions, midazolam and the Liverpool protocol. Have a good death. Wait a minute, that's not a health care treatment. That's something, basically murder. And let's get them off the pension program, and have numbers that scare people so that more money can go into the system. So the fraud is essentially very simple. Follow the money. The money is being controlled by big pharma. They want to have all of these financial organizations, whether it's the World Bank and the Pandemic Fund, or the International Monetary Fund, or the Asian or African Development Bank, or whatever, billions of dollars to make things that harm people. And I've for years referred to tests and drugs and jabs not as healing products, but those are actually customer acquisition tools. If you can take a
yeah,
healthy person, convince them that some number on a test means that they have an asymptomatic case of some disease, invite them, to go fill out a prescription and pick it up at the pharmacy, because I think the P is silent, and swallow a poison on a daily basis in pursuit of health. And then, here in our world, if you go to the grocery store, they have a pharmacy in the back, and there's always, on the loudspeakers, go get your shingles vaccine, go get your flu vaccine. Well, the programming, gets people to inject poison into their body to protect themselves against an invisible boogeyman. That builds the business model. People who do that on a regular basis wake up every morning and swallow 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 poisons and inject poison. They're far more likely to be a customer of the industry that is selling them on the idea that swallowing poison is the pathway to health. That's kind of sort of the definition of pharmakia. And anything with two snakes, as their symbol, should give you a clue that you're being deceived. So, I've been in this world for half my life for sure, and for an extra 15 years, I was healthy and lucky enough to just not go to a medical doctor. And when you realize that there are so many other ways to deal with the scary problems that they want you to think that they have the only solution, uh, until people awaken to the fraud that is being perpetrated, and now they want to finance with billions of more dollars. It's astonishing to think that the problem that they're trying to solve is that big pharma just wasn't big enough, and that they need our money to build out their industry globally so that they can have an unlimited amount of these toxic products, so that their idea of pharmakia becomes a global public good. Well, I don't think it's very good. I think it's horrible, and pushing back on it with every ounce of my being. I invite everybody. I always give my phone number. So my number is 310-619-3055. I'm in California. You can use Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp or text message or whatever. And everything's on my Substack, jamesroguski.substack.com. I encourage people to not believe a word I just said. That's hearsay. Okay? Go read the documents, see for yourself, and follow the money, because this isn't about your health. They want to degrade your health so that they can increase their wealth.
Yeah. Do you get the feeling, James, that this is probably the last question really, that this is being controlled by particular groups and individuals? We won't name any, but do you get the feeling there's someone up there sort of pulling the strings, or is this more of a sort of a collective movement of industry and corporate interest?
If you want to get philosophical about, how all of this
it's much more conspiratorial, really.
My take on it is, the best way I think to explain it is, if you've ever seen the idea, there's an angel on this shoulder whispering into your ear, and there's a demon on this shoulder whispering into your ear. Some people listen to really bad ideas, but they think that they're doing God's work. Now, they may be trying to save someone from cancer by developing CRISPR gene editing technology, okay? And they can't see any of the natural ways that you just avoid problems. And so the area of interest for me is, what is the realm in which ideas get implanted into people's minds, and then when new information comes in, it has to get under their subconscious programming. And so what we're dealing with is pretty much what I think I related earlier. There are a lot of people who apparently still believe that masks work and PCR tests are a valid way of determining that another human being is a danger to you because they failed a test. And drugs like midazolam and remdesivir are of benefit to humanity, and the mRNA platform is safe and effective. I'm sure that everyone in the audience knows someone who you just can't seem to dislodge those beliefs, right? So the conspiracy is in the world of ideas, where propaganda and repetition and kowtowing to authority. Oh, somebody said this, so you've accepted it. The problem is hearsay apparently gets into the subconscious, and facts and data have to try to dislodge that. Unfortunately, even though I'm on your side, and I'm a fact-based data, give me the evidence kind of guy, the problem is the emotional appeal and the fear-mongering, right? And the guilt and whatever other emotional thing is used by those who are pushing this pharmaceutical agenda, it's actually more powerful. And until we stop showing up at with a knife at a gunfight, we're showing up with data at an emotional battle. And I don't like to try to manipulate people's emotions. I don't like it when people try to do that to me. There's fear-mongering all over the internet. I appreciate your work bringing data and facts and information, and it appeals to people who still can, override that programming and practice the scientific method and bring it in. But there's a lot of people who are governed by their fears and their guilt and their whatever other emotion. And I wish I knew how to snap them out of it. But that's the challenge of our times.
Yeah. Very last question, James, and this is an emotional question. If you woke up tomorrow morning and the United Kingdom and the United States had decided to withdraw from the World Health Organization, what emotion would you experience?
If I decided to withdraw, well,
No,
I'll
if the
answer
United if the United States decided to withdraw.
I would say that that would be a good start. But what we really need is for everyone in the audience to wake up every morning and withdraw from big pharma. If you open up your medicine cabinet every day and you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 products that are, poisoning you, and you go back to the pharmacy and you are feeding the beast of big pharma rather than your herbalist or your homeopath or your naturopath or whatever, then withdrawing from the WHO will have been, not really a victory. Yes, we want to do that. It would, put a smile on my face that some nation did that. But that's the tail, right? The beast that's wagging the WHO is big pharma. And until mentally, emotionally, physically, chemically, people are, extracting themselves from that beast, we will still have to deal with it, whether it goes through the WHO or through your federal, state, local, provincial, city, district, or school board or whatever. It's pervasive. And in the United States, I think we lead the world. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of our economy is based on the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex. A lot of those people do a lot of good, wonderful work.
Of course.
But a lot of it causes an awful lot of harm. And until we straighten that out and head in the right direction, one of the recent things I published is a little article that I want to develop. I've been telling people I want to get out of the who and on with the new. If you go to thecompleteguidetohealth.com, you'll see the starting point that anybody who wants to work to build the replacement, just a way of thinking that you don't just reflexively, call your doctor and ask for a drug. You go, what else could I do to maintain and optimize my health before you allow it to crumble and then you're suffering from dis-ease? There is a world of other things that people can and should do. So to answer your question, sure, I'd have a smile on my face. Possibly in January in the United States, there may be a new administration. And my hope is that they look at the WHO and they say, sayonara, we're out of here. That might cause it to crumble. There's rumblings with the BRICS nations that, they need a better alternative because the WHO, contrary to popular belief, is mostly controlled by the US and the EU and the UK. And so the smaller nations are not all that happy. What's preventing them from just saying goodbye? We're going to go do our own thing. Not that they would not also be under the influence of big pharma. So this is a much bigger thing than amendments or a treaty. This is an outlook on life and health, and that has to come back to each individual man, woman, or child making the decisions that are best for them with whatever health advisor and practitioner they get information from. It's quite a task that we have ahead of us, but on one level, it's very simple. You make your own choices, your body, your choice, but wise up and make better choices. Explore more options other than just drugs and jabs and what's coming from big pharma, because they don't care about you. They just want to make a profit.
James, as always, excellent summary. Thank you so much. Always welcome back on, of course, if there's anything you want to report or new developments.
Thank you, John.
And,
appreciate your work. Bless you.
No, you've just worked on this full time for the last 4 years. It's just incredible. So thank you for what you've done, James.
Thank you.